Tonight, we're going back to a time when the most powerful empires in the world controlled the seas, and a tiny nation, sitting on land reclaimed from floodwater, decided that was simply not going to stand. Before we go any further, I want to tell you how this night is going to go. You're going to hear a story, a long, slow, deeply layered story that stretches across centuries and oceans. It will take us from the flooded marshlands of what is now the Netherlands, through the spice-rich waters of the Indonesian archipelago, into the heart of the North Sea where fleets of hundreds of ships met in cannon, smoke so thick that sailors sometimes could not tell whether the sun had set or whether the world had simply ended. It will take us through the boardrooms of the most sophisticated financial institution the 17th century had ever produced, into the cabins of admirals who died on their own decks, and through the minds of engineers who redesigned the ship itself from the keel up and in doing so rewrote the economics of global trade. This is not a quick story. It is not meant to be. It is meant to carry you, slowly, steadily, through one of the most remarkable chapters in the history of human ambition. And somewhere along the way, somewhere between the rigging and the cannon fire, and the smell of salt and pine tar, you are going to drift off, and the story will keep going, and when you wake up tomorrow, you will feel as though you have sailed somewhere and returned. So settle in. To understand why the Dutch became the greatest naval power in the world during the 17th century, you have to first understand something about where they came from, and where they came from was, by any reasonable measure, not a place that should have produced a civilization at all. The land that we now call the Netherlands sits at the mouth of three of Europe's largest rivers, the Rhine, the Maas, and the Scheldt. For thousands of years this area was not so much land as it was a negotiation between land and water, a shifting, unreliable frontier of mudflats, peat bogs and shallow tidal estuaries that flooded regularly and drained reluctantly. The Romans, who had an opinion about everything, called the people who lived there incorrigible for choosing to do so. A Roman writer named Pliny the Elder visited in the 1st century AD and described seeing the local population during a flood, standing on raised mounds of earth surrounded by water in every direction, looking to him less like inhabitants of a country and more like survivors of a shipwreck, clinging to whatever rose above the tide. But those people did not leave. They stayed, and they adapted, and over many centuries they developed something that no empire and no army had yet taught them. They developed a profound, intimate technical expertise with water itself. They learned to read it, to move it, to hold it back, to direct it. They built dikes, not as individual acts of engineering, but as community projects that required villages and towns to cooperate under threat of collective drowning. They invented the windmill not as a picturesque ornament, but as a machine, a pump, something that could lift water from low-lying fields up into canals and out into the sea. They created a landscape that was, in the most literal possible sense, manufactured. Approximately a third of what is now the Netherlands lies below sea level. Not naturally elevated land that happens to be close to the coast, but land that was once sea floor and has been converted through centuries of unrelenting labour into usable ground. This is not background information. This is the entire foundation of everything that follows. Because when you live your entire life in a relationship with water, when your survival depends on understanding how water moves, what it does when it is channeled, what it costs when it escapes, and what it gives when it is controlled, you develop a set of instincts and capabilities that translate directly and immediately into maritime power. A people who have spent generations building canals and managing tidal flows are not the same as a people who have spent those generations farming inland plains or herding cattle on stable hillsides. They think differently about the sea. They are not afraid of it in the way that inland peoples tend to be. They understand in their bones that water is not an obstacle. It is a highway. The Dutch also developed something else in those centuries of flood and survival, a particular kind of politics. Because the dikes required everyone to cooperate. Because a farmer who broke the system of water management harmed not just himself, but every neighbour for miles in every direction. The communities that built the Netherlands developed early and durable traditions of collective decision-making, negotiation, and shared governance. They called it the polder model, the idea that when the water is rising, you cannot afford to let disagreements fester. You have to talk, you have to compromise, you have to reach a workable agreement, because the alternative is that everyone drowns. This model of governance, pragmatic, consensus-driven, suspicious of absolute power, would prove just as important to Dutch naval dominance as any ship design or battle tactic. By the late 16th century, the Netherlands was nominally part of the Spanish Empire, or rather, the northern provinces of what we now call the Low Countries were. The Spanish had inherited them through a complicated series of dynastic marriages, and the Habsburg rulers in Madrid regarded the northern provinces as a useful source of tax revenue and a strategic buffer against France and England, but not as a place that deserved particular attention or respect. The Dutch, for their part, regarded Spanish rule with increasing resentment. There were religious conflicts. The Dutch had moved strongly toward Calvinism, while the Spanish were militantly Catholic, and there were economic conflicts, because the Spanish kept interfering with trade in ways that struck the Dutch merchant classes as both irrational and ruinous. And there were political conflicts because the Dutch had their own long-standing traditions of local governance and representative assemblies, and they did not appreciate being overruled by a king who had never visited and showed no signs of intending to. The breaking point came in the 1560s. The Duke of Alba, Philip II of Spain's chosen instrument in the Low Countries, arrived in Brussels with an army and a mandate to crush heresy and reimpose order. What followed was a campaign of such sustained brutality, mass executions, collective punishment, the systematic destruction of towns that resisted, that it produced exactly the opposite of what Philip had intended. Instead of crushing resistance, it unified it. The northern provinces, led by the province of Holland and the figure of William the Silent, Prince of Orange, began what would become an 80-year war of independence against the most powerful empire in the world. And here is where the water comes in again. The Spanish army was magnificent. It was the finest land-fighting force in Europe, battle-hardened by wars in Italy and North Africa, organised with a discipline and tactical sophistication that other European armies could not match. On land, the Dutch could not beat it. They knew this from the beginning, so they did something that in hindsight seems obvious, but in practice required extraordinary courage and vision. They flooded their own country, they broke their own dikes, they let the water in, and they used the resulting waterscape, the maze of flooded fields and shallow canals and marshy estuaries, as their primary defensive system. Spanish cavalry was useless in knee-deep water. Spanish infantry could not move quickly through flooded terrain, and on the water itself the Dutch were, at home in a way that Spanish soldiers simply were not. It was a brutal strategy, flooding your own farmland, destroying your own livelihoods, displacing your own people, but it worked, and it established, at the very beginning of the Dutch Republic's existence, a relationship between national survival and maritime power that would define everything that came after. The Union of Utrecht in 1579 formally united the 7 northern provinces, Holland, Zeeland, Utrecht, Friesland, Overijssel, Gelderland and Groningen, into what would become the Dutch Republic. They declared independence from Spain in 1581 with a document called the Act of Abjuration, which laid out a remarkably clear and modern argument that a king who fails his duties to his people forfeits the right to govern them. The Spanish refused to recognise this. The war continued, but the Republic existed, and it was going to need a navy. The Dutch Republic in the last decades of the 16th century was not a wealthy country. It was a country at war, with its agricultural heartland regularly flooded, its trade routes disrupted, and its primary port of Antwerp, which had been the commercial capital of northern Europe, closed off by Spanish military control. The Republic had inherited a series of complex problems and not very many resources with which to solve them. What it did have was fish. This sounds almost comically small as the foundation of an empire, but it is absolutely true that the herring fishery was one of the central pillars on which Dutch prosperity and ultimately Dutch naval power was built. The North Sea in the 16th century was extraordinarily rich in herring, massive dense shoals of them that moved through the waters off the coast of Scotland and Norway with a regularity that the Dutch had been tracking and exploiting for centuries. The key innovation was not the catching of herring, but the preserving of it. Sometime in the 14th century, a Dutchman, named Willem Bokelsoen, or at least that is the name that legend has attached to the invention, developed a method of gutting and salting herring at sea in barrels aboard the fishing vessel itself. This allowed herring fleets to stay at sea for weeks or even months at a time, filling their holds with preserved fish that could be sold throughout Europe. The herring trade did several things simultaneously. It generated enormous revenue. Herring was one of the most widely consumed proteins in Europe, particularly during the Catholic practice of abstaining from meat on Fridays and throughout Lent. It created a massive and experienced population of Dutch sailors who spent their entire lives at sea. It drove demand for ships, which drove the development of Dutch shipbuilding into one of the most sophisticated industries in the world. And it created the capital that the Dutch merchant class used to invest in increasingly ambitious trading ventures. From herring, the Dutch moved to grain. The Baltic trade, the movement of grain, timber, iron and naval stores from the Baltic Sea region down through the Danish Straits and into Western Europe, was one of the most economically critical trades in the early modern period. Cities throughout Western Europe depended on Baltic grain to survive, and the Dutch, with their geographic position at the outlet of the Rhine and their well-developed maritime infrastructure, became the dominant carriers of this trade. The Dutch called it the moeder negotiae, the mother trade, and they guarded it jealously, because without it, they understood, their entire economic ecosystem would collapse. What the Baltic trade did, beyond generating wealth, was teach the Dutch something crucial about the economics of shipping. The key insight was this: the cost of moving goods is almost always the determining factor in whether a trade is profitable. If you can move a given cargo for less than your competitor, you can undercut his price, take his customers, and still make money while he goes bankrupt. The Dutch became obsessed with driving down the cost of shipping, not through cutting corners on quality, they were meticulous about that, but through a relentless, systematic attention to efficiency in every aspect of ship design and operation. This obsession with maritime efficiency was not just a commercial strategy. It was, ultimately, the engine that made the Dutch Republic competitive at sea against powers that were dramatically larger, wealthier in raw resources, and backed by the full machinery of established monarchies. The Dutch could not win a spending contest against Spain or England. What they could do was outthink, out-innovate, and outmaneuver those powers, and they did. The herring fleets and the Baltic traders created something else that would prove invaluable when war came. They created a reserve of experienced sailors that was, per capita, almost certainly the largest in the world. When the Republic needed to man warships, it did not have to train sailors from scratch. It had a population that had been going to sea since childhood, that understood navigation and rigging and weather and seamanship in an intimate, practical way that no amount of formal training could replicate. This human capital, the accumulated maritime knowledge of an entire society, was one of the Dutch Republic's greatest strategic assets, and it is one that is easy to overlook when focusing on the more dramatic elements of ship design and battle tactics. The ports of Holland and Zeeland, Amsterdam, Rotterdam, Flushing, Enkhuizen, Hoorn, were not incidental backdrops to Dutch history. They were the engines of the Republic, the places where wealth was created, where decisions were made, where the infrastructure of empire was built and maintained. Amsterdam in particular grew with extraordinary speed during the late 16th and early 17th centuries, absorbing refugees and merchants from Antwerp after the Spanish took that city in 1585, drawing in skilled workers, traders and financiers from all over Europe and developing financial instruments, bills of exchange, stock companies, futures contracts, marine insurance, that were genuinely novel and that gave Dutch merchants tools that their competitors did not have. Amsterdam's rise to become the commercial capital of the world during the 17th century was one of the most dramatic urban transformations in history. In 1550, it was a modest regional port, significant in the Baltic trade but not yet the dominant force in European commerce. By 1650, it was unquestionably the centre of the global economy, the place where prices were set, where credit was created, where the largest and most consequential business deals in the world were struck. The population grew from perhaps 30,000 in 1570 to over 200,000 by 1670, fed by continuous waves of immigration from every corner of Europe. The immigrants who poured into Amsterdam in the late 16th and early 17th centuries were not random. They were, disproportionately, the most skilled, the most entrepreneurial, and the most intellectually sophisticated people in Europe. When Antwerp fell to the Spanish in 1585, its merchant community, one of the most capable commercial classes in the world, largely decamped to Amsterdam, bringing capital, commercial networks, and expertise. Sephardic Jews, expelled from Spain in 1492 and from Portugal a few years later, found in the Dutch Republic a degree of tolerance unmatched elsewhere in Europe, and brought with them extraordinary commercial connections throughout the Mediterranean and beyond. Huguenots fleeing religious persecution in France, Protestant refugees from the Spanish Netherlands, skilled artisans from across the continent, all found in Amsterdam a city that was willing, in a spirit of pragmatic tolerance that was partly principled and partly commercial, to leave them alone and let them work. This diversity was not merely ethically admirable, it was commercially and militarily decisive. The knowledge networks that these immigrant communities maintained across Europe and the Mediterranean gave Amsterdam merchants intelligence about market conditions, political developments, and commercial opportunities that homogeneous communities could not access. A Spanish-speaking Sephardic merchant in Amsterdam had family and commercial contacts in Lisbon, Venice, Constantinople, and a dozen other cities. A Huguenot cloth merchant had connections throughout the French textile industry. This web of connections was a form of commercial intelligence infrastructure of enormous value, and it was one of the things that Amsterdam's tolerance purchased for the Republic. Marine insurance is worth pausing on for a moment, because it is one of those innovations that sounds dry but had profound practical consequences. Before marine insurance became widely available, the loss of a single ship could ruin a merchant family. This meant that merchants were, by necessity, conservative. They avoided long-distance, high-risk ventures because the downside was catastrophic. Marine insurance changed this calculus completely. It spread the risk of any individual voyage across a large pool of underwriters, which meant that a merchant could afford to lose a ship without being destroyed financially, which meant that merchants could afford to take risks they would never have taken before. The result was a dramatic increase in the ambition and geographical reach of Dutch trading ventures, and therefore a dramatic increase in the maritime experience and capability of the Republic as a whole. All of this, the herring, the Baltic trade, the shipbuilding industry, the financial innovation, the experienced sailor population, formed the material foundation on which Dutch naval power would be built. But the spark that lit it all was the war against Spain, because the war against Spain created an urgent existential necessity that concentrated minds wonderfully and forced the Republic to develop, in very short order, the naval capabilities that would eventually astonish the world. In the annals of technological innovation, there are inventions that improve things by degrees, a little faster, a little stronger, a little more efficient, and then there are inventions that reorganize entire systems of power, that make existing advantages irrelevant and create new hierarchies from nothing. The Dutch fluyt was the second kind. It was one of those rare moments in history when a piece of technology changed the rules so completely that everyone who did not adopt it was left behind. The fluyt, the word is Dutch, sometimes anglicised as flyboat, was developed in the town of Hoorn around 1595, during the period when the Republic was fighting Spain, scrambling for revenues and desperately trying to make its shipping more economical. It was designed by a shipbuilder whose name history has not perfectly preserved. The credit is sometimes given to Pieter Jansz Leon, though this is disputed, and it was designed to solve a specific and pressing problem. The Dutch paid a toll every time their ships passed through the Danish Sound, the narrow strait between Denmark and Sweden that controlled access to the Baltic. The toll was calculated partly based on the width of a ship's deck, which meant that a ship with a wide deck was more expensive to operate on the Baltic route than a ship with a narrow one. The solution the Dutch engineers arrived at was a ship with a strikingly unusual hull form. The fluyt had a pear-shaped cross-section, wide at its maximum beam below the waterline, but narrowing dramatically as it rose toward the deck. From above, the deck of a fluyt was quite narrow. From the side, the hull bulged outward below, giving it a fat, almost pregnant appearance that contemporary observers sometimes found faintly ridiculous. But this shape accomplished several things simultaneously and brilliantly. First, it reduced the Danish toll, because the toll was measured at the deck, which was narrow. Second, because the hull was widest below the waterline, the fluyt could carry a very large cargo volume without proportionally increasing its topside profile. Third, and this is where the design genius becomes truly apparent, the fluyt was optimized entirely for cargo, not for fighting. It carried almost no guns. It had a very small crew relative to its cargo capacity. It was designed with block and tackle rigs that could be managed by far fewer sailors than a conventional cargo ship of comparable size. The crew savings were dramatic. A contemporary cargo ship of similar carrying capacity might require a crew of 30 or 40 men. A fluyt could be operated by 15 or even fewer. In an era when sailors' wages were one of the largest operating costs in maritime trade, this was a revolution. It meant that the Dutch could offer freight rates that were simply impossible for competitors to match. English merchants, Hanseatic merchants, Portuguese merchants, they could not compete with Dutch shipping costs, and they knew it. An English pamphleteer writing in the mid-17th century complained bitterly that the Dutch were destroying English commerce simply by being cheaper, not through trickery or underhanded dealing, but through genuine superiority of design and efficiency. By 1670, the Dutch merchant fleet is estimated to have consisted of somewhere between 15,000 and 20,000 vessels. England's fleet, at the same time, numbered perhaps 3,000 to 4,000. Spain's merchant marine was a fraction of that. The Dutch, with a population smaller than England's and a territory that could fit into Spain many times over, had built a commercial maritime fleet that dominated the seas almost as completely as the Royal Navy would dominate them in the following century. But the fluyt's significance did not end with commerce. It had military implications that were not immediately obvious, but proved to be profound. The fluyt was not a warship, and no one ever confused it for one. But the Dutch merchant fleet, composed overwhelmingly of fluyts, was a vast reserve of trained sailors, experienced navigators, and maritime infrastructure. When the Republic needed to expand its naval capacity, when war demanded more warships than the permanent navy could provide, it could convert fluyts into armed auxiliary vessels, or more importantly, it could draw on the experienced crews of the merchant fleet to man the warships it did build. The fluyt created a maritime economy so large and so deeply embedded in Dutch society that the distinction between the merchant marine and the navy was, in times of war, somewhat artificial. The Republic's entire population was, in a meaningful sense, a naval reserve. The fluyt also drove the development of Dutch shipbuilding infrastructure. The yards at Zaandam, just north of Amsterdam, became the most productive and technologically advanced shipbuilding complex in the world. They introduced standardized hull designs that could be produced faster than conventional custom-built ships. They used wind-powered saws, another Dutch innovation, to process timber more quickly than hand-sawing allowed. They built in series, using the same templates and fittings repeatedly, in ways that prefigure modern industrial production more than they resemble the craft-based shipbuilding of their contemporaries. The yards at Zaandam deserve a longer look, because they represent something genuinely novel in the history of manufacturing. By the 1640s and 1650s, the Zaandam shipyards had developed what we would today recognise as proto-industrial production methods that anticipated the principles of factory production by more than a century and a half. The process was systematic in a way that craft-based production had never been. Timber was pre-processed by wind-powered sawmills into standardized dimensions. Hull sections were pre-cut to templates so that they could be fitted together rapidly. Rope walks producing standardized diameter rope of consistent quality supplied multiple yards simultaneously. The result was that a competent Zaandam yard could complete a merchant vessel in weeks rather than months, a rate of production that would have seemed impossible to a shipbuilder in Venice or Lisbon operating in the traditional craft manner. This industrial capacity had a direct military application in wartime, when the Republic needed to replace losses quickly or expand its naval strength rapidly. The English Navy, building larger and more elaborate ships in its royal dockyards, could not match the Dutch rate of production, even when it had more money to spend. Quality in Dutch shipbuilding was not sacrificed to speed, it was achieved through standardization and experience rather than through slow craft customization. A fluyt built in Zaandam in 1650 was not a compromise product. It was a highly refined commercial vessel that had been optimized through decades of incremental improvement to be exactly what it needed to be. The fluyt also demonstrates something important about Dutch culture more broadly, the willingness to specialize radically in pursuit of efficiency. The fluyt was deliberately made defenseless, stripped of the guns and bulwarks that a conventional cargo ship would carry for self-defense, because the Dutch calculated that the cost savings from the stripped-down design outweighed the risk of capture. This was not a naive calculation. The Dutch Navy existed specifically to protect the merchant fleet, and in the zones where the Navy could not provide protection, the fluyt was paired with armed escorts rather than independently armed. This separation of functions, the merchant ship optimized, purely for cargo, The warship optimized purely for fighting was a form of economic specialization applied to maritime power, and it was more efficient than the hybrid alternatives that other nations pursued. Tsar Peter the Great of Russia understood this. When Peter came to the Netherlands in 1697 on his Grand Embassy, a tour of Western Europe designed to absorb the most advanced techniques of the age, he went to Zaandam specifically to work in the shipyards. He worked there under an assumed name, trying to learn the secrets of Dutch ship construction, because he understood that whoever could build ships as efficiently as the Dutch held an almost unassailable commercial and military advantage. He eventually moved on to Deptford in England, which he considered more systematic in its methods, but the fact that he came to Zaandam first tells you everything about the reputation those yards had earned. The fluyt then was not just a ship, it was a system, a technological platform that reorganized the economics of maritime trade, created the material conditions for Dutch commercial dominance, generated the sailor population that the Republic's navy would draw on, and drove the development of an industrial shipbuilding capacity that could produce warships with a speed and cost-effectiveness that astonished rivals. Understanding it is essential to understanding how a small republic could compete with empires that had far greater reserves of money, men, and territory. The Dutch did not win by throwing more resources at the problem. They won by being more clever about the resources they had, and cleverness, it turned out, was something they had in abundance. In the spring of 1602, the States General of the Dutch Republic granted a charter to a new organisation called the Verenigde Oostindische Compagnie, the United East India Company, universally known by its Dutch initials as the VOC. The charter was unusual in several respects. It gave the VOC the exclusive right to trade in all waters east of the Cape of Good Hope and west of the Strait of Magellan. It authorised the company to make treaties with foreign rulers, to build fortresses, to maintain armed forces, and to wage war. It was, in short, a private company authorised by the government to exercise the powers of a sovereign state in the name of profit, and it was the first institution of its kind in history. To understand what the VOC represented and why it mattered to Dutch naval power, you have to understand the problem it was designed to solve. By the end of the 16th century, the Dutch had established trading connections with the Spice Islands, the Maluku archipelago in what is now eastern Indonesia, through a series of increasingly ambitious and dangerous voyages. The first Dutch expedition to reach the East Indies, organised by a merchant named Cornelis de Houtman, departed from Amsterdam in 1595 and returned in 1597 with enough spice to prove that the voyage was viable, even though more than a third of the crew had died en route, and de Houtman had managed to start a war with a local sultanate through a combination of arrogance and poor judgment. The voyage was a commercial success despite everything, and it triggered an explosion of competing Dutch expeditions. Between 1598 and 1601, no fewer than 65 Dutch ships sailed for the East Indies, organised by competing companies from Amsterdam, Zeeland, Rotterdam, and other Dutch cities. They competed fiercely with each other, driving up the price of spices in Asia and driving down the price in Europe through oversupply, and they frequently got in each other's way militarily and diplomatically, to the great amusement of their Portuguese and Spanish competitors. The States General, which understood commercial policy with unusual sophistication, recognised that this competition was self-defeating. The solution they imposed was the VOC, a forced merger of all the competing East India companies into a single organisation, with a central board of directors called the Heren Zeventien, the 17 Lords, who would set overall policy, and with regional chambers in Amsterdam, Zeeland, and several other cities who would handle day-to-day operations. The initial capitalisation of the VOC was 6.4 million guilders, which was more than 10 times the capitalisation of the English East India Company founded 2 years earlier. This made it, at its founding, the largest company in the world. The VOC's structure was also genuinely novel. It was financed by shares that could be bought and sold, the world's first publicly traded stock, and it operated on an ongoing basis rather than on the voyage-by-voyage basis that had characterised earlier trading ventures. This meant that it could plan on a long-time horizon, investing in fixed assets like fortresses and shipyards that would not show a return for years, in ways that earlier voyage-based companies could not. It could also absorb losses on individual voyages without collapsing, because its capital base was distributed across many shareholders rather than concentrated in a few investors who could withdraw their money if one voyage went badly. The Amsterdam Exchange Bank, founded in 1609, provided the financial infrastructure that made all of this work. It accepted deposits, facilitated the transfer of funds between accounts, and maintained a stable currency at a time when European coinage was notoriously debased and unreliable. The bank's stability made Amsterdam the financial centre of Europe and gave the VOC access to credit on terms that no competitor could match. But the VOC's most startling feature, the one that made it relevant to naval history in a way that no mere trading company would be, was its military power. The VOC was authorized to build and maintain a standing military force. It built warships, it recruited soldiers, it constructed fortresses, it fought wars. By the mid-17th century, the VOC maintained a fleet of warships that was, in aggregate, larger than the navies of many European states. It had garrisons in dozens of locations across Asia. It could mobilize military force on a scale that only major powers could match. This private military capacity served multiple purposes. The most obvious was the protection of trade routes and trading posts against the Portuguese and Spanish, who regarded the Dutch presence in Asia as an intolerable violation of their papal-granted monopoly on trade with the East. The Portuguese had established a network of fortified trading posts throughout the Indian Ocean and South Asian archipelago that stretched from Goa on the Indian coast to Malacca on the Malay Peninsula to the Spice Islands themselves. The Dutch intended to take this network away from them, or at least to compete with it effectively, and they understood from the beginning that this would require force. The man who built the VOC's Asian Empire was Jan Pieterszoon Cohen, who served as Governor-General of the Dutch East Indies from 1618 to 1623, and again from 1627 to 1629. Cohen was brilliant, ruthless, and possessed of a clarity of vision about commercial strategy that was married to a willingness to deploy violence with a completeness that even his contemporaries found alarming. He understood that control of the spice trade required not just trading posts but monopoly control of the supply itself, the ability to dictate to the growers of nutmeg and cloves on which terms they would sell and to whom. When the inhabitants of the Banda Islands, who produced most of the world's nutmeg, declined to honour exclusive contracts with the VOC and continued selling to other buyers, Cohen responded by organising a military expedition that killed, enslaved, or drove out virtually the entire indigenous population of the islands and replaced them with Dutch planters using enslaved labour to grow the nutmeg under controlled conditions. The Banda Massacre of 1621 stands as one of the great atrocities of colonial history. It also accomplished exactly what Cohen intended commercially. The VOC achieved effective monopoly control over the world's nutmeg supply, and the profits that flowed from this monopoly funded the company's military and commercial expansion across the rest of Asia. The VOC's headquarters in Asia was Batavia, modern-day Jakarta, founded by Cohen in 1619 on the site of a Javanese port he had destroyed. From Batavia, the VOC coordinated trade routes across the entire Indian Ocean and the Western Pacific, connecting the spice-producing islands of eastern Indonesia with the markets of Japan, China, India, Persia, and ultimately Europe. The VOC became the dominant maritime power in Asian waters, not just because it had guns, but because it had a financial structure, a planning horizon, and a logistical infrastructure that its competitors could not match. What this meant for Dutch naval power in the broader sense is this. The VOC was, in effect, a military training ground and a naval laboratory, operating at the far end of the world from Europe. The officers who commanded VOC warships in Asian waters developed tactical and operational experience in sustained naval warfare that was directly transferable to the wars in European waters. The engineers who built VOC fortresses and harbour facilities learned skills that could be applied to the defence of Dutch ports at home. The logistical systems that kept VOC garrisons supplied across 10,000 miles of ocean were, in principle, applicable to supplying naval squadrons in the North Sea. The VOC also provided the Republic with something perhaps more important than any specific military capability. It provided a financial base of enormous strength that funded the Republic's ability to sustain prolonged warfare against much larger powers. The dividends paid to VOC shareholders were, for most of the 17th century, extraordinary, averaging around 18% per year, which made VOC shares the most sought-after investment in Europe. This meant that the Republic's merchant class was invested literally and figuratively in the success of the naval power that protected the VOC's trade routes. When the States General voted funds for naval expansion, it was voting to protect the investments of its own most influential citizens. The alignment of commercial and military interest that resulted was one of the most powerful drivers of Dutch naval development in the 17th century. Long before the Dutch Republic had admirals of international fame, before it had the fluyt in large numbers, before it had the VOC or the Amsterdam Exchange Bank, it had a war to survive, and that war taught it, through the brutal pedagogy of necessity, how to fight at sea. The earliest significant naval engagement of the Dutch revolt against Spain took place in 1573, in the shallow waters of the Zuider Zee, the large inland sea that sat behind the Dutch coast, connected to the North Sea by narrow channels. It is a battle that most people outside the Netherlands have never heard of, but it deserves attention because it established patterns that would define Dutch naval thinking for generations. The context was this: the Spanish were besieging the city of Alkmaar, and the Dutch sea beggars, the ragged, fiercely motivated sailors who had been fighting a guerrilla naval war against Spain for years, needed to hold the waterways around the city. The Spanish assembled a fleet of warships and transports on the Zuider Zee to support their land operations and to cut off the Dutch ability to resupply besieged cities. The Dutch, under a commander named Cornelis Dirkzoon, had a fleet of smaller vessels, fast, shallow draft ships that were well suited to the coastal and estuarine waters of Holland, but not to open ocean fighting. The battle that resulted was messy and chaotic, as most early period naval battles were, but it had an outcome that was decisive. The Dutch won. The Spanish fleet was scattered and partially destroyed, the siege of Alkmaar was relieved, and the Dutch learned something that would become almost a philosophical principle of their naval approach, that fighting in waters you know better than your enemy, using ships suited to those waters, and refusing to engage on terms that favour the stronger opponent is not cowardice, it is intelligence. This lesson was reinforced repeatedly in the years that followed. The Dutch became expert at what we might today call asymmetric warfare at sea, using mobility, local knowledge, and the peculiarities of their shallow, coastal waters to neutralise the advantages of larger, more heavily armed opponents. They used fire ships, vessels filled with combustible material and set alight, then steered toward enemy-anchored fleets with particular effectiveness. They raided, harassed, and disrupted Spanish supply lines. They made the cost of operating in Dutch coastal waters so high that the Spanish naval presence was persistently undermined. But the Dutch also recognised, as the Republic's economic prosperity grew in the late 16th and early 17th centuries, that guerrilla tactics at sea were insufficient. You could harass an enemy and make his life difficult, but you could not control trade routes and protect commercial shipping through harassment alone. You needed to be able to meet an enemy fleet in open water and defeat it outright. This required a different kind of naval power, a permanent, well-funded, well-organised navy, with purpose-built warships capable of fighting in any waters, not just the shallow coastal zones where the Dutch had their natural advantages. The development of this permanent navy was not a smooth or straightforward process. The Dutch Republic was a confederation, not a centralised state, and the naval administration reflected this. There were 5 admiralties, boards responsible for naval affairs in their respective regions: the Admiralty of the Maas, based in Rotterdam, the Admiralty of Amsterdam, the Admiralty of Zeeland, the Admiralty of Friesland, and the Admiralty of the North Quarter, based in Hoorn and Enkhuizen. Each admiralty maintained its own fleet, its own yards, and its own officer corps. They were funded through customs duties collected in their respective regions, and they jealously guarded their autonomy against each other and against any central authority. This fragmented structure was, in conventional military analysis, a weakness, and it was. It made unified command difficult, it created logistical inefficiencies, and it meant that the Dutch Navy never achieved the kind of centralised administration that the English Navy was developing under the Commonwealth and later the Restoration Monarchy. But it also had a compensating strength. It meant that the Republic's naval capacity was distributed across multiple centres, each with its own infrastructure and supply base, so that destroying any single port or admiralty did not cripple the whole. And it meant that the naval establishment was deeply embedded in the commercial life of the major port cities, with all that implied in terms of access to skilled labour, maritime expertise, and financial resources. The development of Dutch naval doctrine, the ideas about how to fight at sea, how to organise fleets, how to coordinate tactics, happened gradually and often painfully through the experience of actual combat. The early period of the 80 Years' War against Spain produced commanders who were brave and sometimes brilliant, but who lacked the systematic tactical thinking that would characterise the later great Dutch admirals. Battles were often confused affairs in which ships fought more or less independently, seeking to close with individual enemy vessels rather than operating as a coordinated fleet. The concept of line-of-battle tactics, the arrangement of a fleet in a single-file line, each ship following the one ahead, presenting broadsides to the enemy, was still being developed during this period and was not yet standard practice. Ships were armed with cannons, but the practice of gunnery was not yet the dominant mode of naval combat. There was still a significant tradition of closing with the enemy, boarding his ships, and fighting hand-to-hand in the manner of soldiers on land rather than the mode of combat that pure artillery at sea implies. What the Dutch were developing through their experience in the shallow and confined waters of their own coast was a set of tactical instincts that emphasised manoeuvre over brute force, flexibility over rigidity, and the exploitation of environmental conditions, wind, tide, depth, over the simple mathematical calculation of which fleet had more guns. These instincts would find their fullest expression in the careers of the great Dutch admirals of the mid-17th century. But they were born here, in the muddy waters of the Zuider Zee and the Schelde estuary, in the desperate improvisations of men fighting for their country's survival with whatever they had. There is a particular quality of naval genius that the Dutch developed in this period that deserves explicit recognition. The ability to see the tactical possibilities of a situation that a less experienced commander would read as unfavourable or even hopeless. This is not just courage, it is a kind of creative reading of the environment, an ability to see how wind and current and depth and the specific characteristics of one's own ships can be turned into advantages even when the odds appear to favour the enemy. It is the naval equivalent of the judo principle, using your opponent's strength and momentum against him, rather than trying to match it directly. This quality would prove decisive in the battles to come. The sea beggars, the watergeuzen as the Dutch called them, deserve a fuller portrait than military histories often give them, because they represent something genuinely remarkable in the annals of naval warfare, a self-organised, politically motivated fighting force that operated with almost no formal support structure for years, and yet managed to establish conditions of sea control that prevented Spain from fully consolidating its conquest of the northern provinces. The watergeuzen had begun as essentially privateers, holders of letters of marque from William of Orange that authorised them to attack Spanish shipping, and their early operations were characterised by the kind of undisciplined violence that privateering invariably produces. They plundered indiscriminately, committed atrocities, and were as likely to attack neutral shipping as Spanish. The English Queen Elizabeth, embarrassed by their presence in English ports, expelled them from Dover in 1572, an act which, entirely contrary to her intentions, sent them directly to the Dutch coast where they seized the port of Brielle and began the liberation of the northern provinces in earnest. The transformation of the Ruyter from pirates into something approaching a professional naval force took years and cost many lives. The process was accelerated by the desperate urgency of the revolt itself. The Spanish were winning on land, and the sea was the only domain in which the Dutch could effectively resist. William of Orange, who was a brilliant political leader if not a particularly gifted military commander, understood this and systematically worked to regularise and discipline the sea beggars, converting them from an irregular force into something that could form the nucleus of a real navy. The admiralties that the Republic eventually established were built on the foundations that this process had created. The specific geography of the Dutch coastal zone was itself a military asset that the early commanders exploited with increasing sophistication. The Zuider Zee, the Wadden Sea, the tidal estuaries of the Rhine, Maas and Schelde, these were waters of extraordinary navigational complexity, filled with shifting sandbanks, strong tidal currents, and channels that changed from year to year as the sand moved. A navigator who did not know these waters intimately was a navigator who would run aground, and a fleet that ran aground in contested territory was a fleet that was finished. The Dutch knew these waters because they lived in them. They had been fishing them, trading in them, and managing the dikes that bordered them for generations. This intimate local knowledge was, in the confined and complex geography of the Dutch coastal zone, worth more than any number of additional guns or ships. The Spanish repeatedly underestimated this advantage and paid for it. Spanish captains, trained in the deep-water seamanship of the Atlantic and Mediterranean, approached the Dutch coastal waters with the tools and instincts of deep-water navigation, and found them woefully insufficient. They ran aground. They misjudged the tides. They found channels that their charts showed as open, blocked by sandbanks that had shifted since the charts were drawn. The Dutch knew where the channels were, because the Dutch pilots who navigated the fighting vessels in these waters had been sailing them since childhood, and carried the knowledge in their heads in a way that no chart could adequately represent. This asymmetry in local knowledge was, in the confined battleground of the Dutch coastal waters, a decisive strategic advantage, one that no amount of Spanish military investment could quickly overcome because it was not a material advantage that could be purchased or copied, but a human advantage accumulated through generations of lived experience with a specific and demanding body of water. Every age of a naval supremacy produces its defining figures, men whose careers crystallize the values and capabilities of their time, who become legends in their own lifetimes, and whose names echo down through the centuries. The Dutch Golden Age produced several such figures, but two stand above the rest, Maarten Tromp and Michiel de Ruyter. Together and in succession, these two admirals embodied the Dutch Republic's naval achievement more completely than any institution or innovation could. Maarten Harpertsoen Tromp was born in 1598 in the city of Brielle, a port that holds an honoured place in Dutch history as the first town to be liberated from Spanish rule during the revolt. His father was a naval officer, and Tromp went to sea as a child. He was captured by English pirates at the age of 9 and spent 2 years in English captivity before managing to escape. This early experience of maritime hardship was not incidental. It shaped a man who was utterly without illusions about the sea and about warfare, who understood from the inside what it meant to be at the mercy of forces larger than yourself, and who developed from that understanding a fierce and practical determination to never be in that position again if it could possibly be avoided. Tromp rose through the Dutch naval hierarchy, through a combination of technical ability, physical courage, and the kind of instinctive tactical intelligence that is very difficult to teach. He had a gift for reading a naval situation, for seeing, in the arrangement of wind and ships and waves, possibilities that less perceptive commanders missed. He was also famous for his relationship with his crews. He was not a man who managed his sailors from a safe distance. He was on the deck, visible, sharing the danger, and his men knew it. In an era when naval captains often maintained a careful separation between themselves and the ordinary sailors, this was unusual enough to be remarked upon, and was a significant factor in the morale and fighting effectiveness of any fleet he commanded. Tromp's most famous moment, indeed one of the most famous moments in the entire history of naval warfare, came in 1652 at the Battle of the Downs and its aftermath, when the story goes that he sailed through the English Channel with a broom tied to his masthead, symbolically sweeping the English from the sea. Whether this is literally true, or a legend that grew around a more prosaic reality, the image captures something real about the spirit in which Tromp approached his profession. He was a man who did not do things by halves. His greatest tactical achievement may have been the Battle of Dungeness in November 1652, where he defeated an English fleet under Admiral Robert Blake and temporarily secured Dutch control of the English Channel. The victory was achieved through aggressive manoeuvring and the willingness to close with the enemy at a moment when a more cautious commander might have held back. Tromp understood that against an English fleet that was, ship for ship, somewhat better armed than his own, the solution was to fight as quickly and aggressively as possible, to remove the advantage of superior gunnery through the confusion of close-range combat and boarding. Tromp was killed in action at the Battle of Scheveningen in 1653, struck by a musket ball during a fierce engagement with an English fleet commanded by George Monk. He was 54 years old. The story, which may or may not be literally true, is that his last words were, "Do not lose courage." The Dutch sailors who witnessed his death are said to have fought with a kind of grief-fueled fury in the hours that followed, refusing to concede defeat even with their admiral dead on the quarterdeck. The Republic mourned him as few figures are mourned, and the inscription on his tomb in the Oude Kerk in Delft describes him as one who had never struck his flag to any enemy, a naval honour of the highest order. But if Tromp was the Republic's first great admiral, Michiel de Ruyter was its greatest. De Ruyter's origins were as far from aristocracy as it was possible to be in Dutch society. He was born in 1607 in Flushing, a port in the province of Zeeland, the son of a rope maker. He went to sea as a child, working as a cabin boy, and then as a sailor on merchant vessels. He did not receive a commission in the Dutch Navy as a young man. He was too low-born for that. Instead, he spent his early career in the merchant marine, rising through the ranks through sheer competence to become the captain of his own vessel by his mid-30s. He commanded trading ships in the Mediterranean and the Baltic, and he was well into middle age, by the standards of the 17th century, positively elderly as a naval recruit, when he first received a naval commission. What made de Ruyter's career possible was a peculiarity of Dutch society that distinguished it from the more aristocratic societies of England and France. Merit to an unusual degree actually mattered. The Dutch Navy was not entirely open to men of low birth. There were social barriers and preferment systems as in any hierarchical institution, but it was more open than most. A man who demonstrated extraordinary competence at sea could rise to command squadrons and fleets in ways that would have been impossible in the English or French navies, where birth and patronage were far more determinative. De Ruyter's career was possible because the Republic needed the best sailors to command its fleets, and de Ruyter was simply, demonstrably, undeniably the best. His tactical genius was of a particular kind. He was not a flamboyant innovator in the manner of some great commanders. He did not reinvent the basic principles of naval warfare. What he did was execute conventional tactical principles with a precision, a flexibility, and a timing that was almost preternatural. He had an extraordinary feel for when to attack and when to hold back, for when a situation that looked desperate contained hidden opportunities, for how to maneuver a fleet of hundreds of ships so that they behaved less like an uncoordinated mob and more like a single, purposeful organism. He was also, by all accounts, a remarkably decent man in an era when military commanders were frequently brutal. He maintained strict discipline in his fleet, but treated his sailors with a genuine concern for their welfare that was unusual. He was known to personally inspect the provisions and conditions aboard ships under his command. He wrote letters home to his family from the most dangerous situations, warm, thoughtful, domestic letters that contrast sharply with the mayhem he was simultaneously orchestrating. In a culture that celebrated martial heroism, de Ruyter embodied something slightly different, a professional competence so complete that it transcended the merely heroic and became something closer to art. Between Tromp and de Ruyter, and alongside them, were dozens of other Dutch naval commanders who deserve mention, even if space does not permit full portraits. Ruyter de With, who was brilliant and quarrelsome, and spent as much energy fighting with his own admirals as with the English, and who died heroically in battle in 1658. Jan Evertsen, whose family provided multiple generations of naval commanders to the Republic. Cornelis Tromp, son of Maarten, who inherited some of his father's tactical gifts but not his diplomatic ones. And Jan de Liefde, Cornelis Evertsen the youngest, and many others who fought the Republic's naval wars in waters ranging from the Caribbean to the Indian Ocean to the frozen approaches to the Baltic. What united these men, beyond their shared nationality, was a common professional culture, a way of thinking about naval warfare that emphasized the practical over the theoretical, the adaptive over the rigid, and the direct exploitation of environmental conditions over any formulaic approach to tactics. They were products of a society that had survived by adapting, that had learned to find advantage in what others saw as disadvantage, and that had built its prosperity through an unrelenting attention to efficiency and improvement. These values, expressed in the context of naval command, produced admirals who were among the finest fighting commanders in the history of sail. The Dutch Republic and England were in many respects natural allies. Both were Protestant nations in a world dominated by Catholic monarchies. Both had commercial economies in which the merchant classes wielded significant political power. Both had constitutional traditions that limited the authority of hereditary rulers. When the Dutch and the English looked at each other across the North Sea in the early 17th century, they should have seen natural partners, and in some respects they did. But in other respects, what they saw was the competition. The fundamental tension between the Dutch Republic and England was commercial. Both nations were maritime trading powers, and they were competing for many of the same markets, the same trade routes, and the same sources of raw material. English merchants watched with growing frustration as Dutch shipping dominated trade routes that they believed, by rights of geography and ambition, should be English. Dutch herring fleets fished in waters that English fishermen considered their own preserve. Dutch carrying trade, the movement of goods between third countries in Dutch ships, was undercutting English merchants in the Baltic, the Mediterranean, and the Levant. The English response was the Navigation Act of 1651, passed by the Commonwealth Parliament under the influence of Oliver Cromwell and the Council of State. The Navigation Act required that goods imported into England must be carried either in English ships or in ships of the country that produced the goods. Since the Dutch merchant marine made much of its profit from carrying goods produced by third countries in Dutch ships, this was a direct attack on the foundations of Dutch commercial prosperity. The Dutch tried to negotiate a modification of the Act. The English refused, and so the First Anglo-Dutch War began in 1652. The First Anglo-Dutch War lasted 2 years, and consisted of a series of naval battles in the North Sea and the English Channel that were among the largest and most intense naval engagements the world had seen to that point. Both sides mobilised enormous fleets, at times 100 ships or more on each side. The battles were fought at close range, with ships hammering each other for hours at a time with broadsides of cannon fire that could be heard from the English coast. Casualties on both sides were severe. The English Navy in 1652 had several structural advantages over the Dutch. Its ships were, in general, somewhat larger and more heavily armed. The English had invested in purpose-built warships of substantial size and firepower, while the Dutch Navy relied heavily on converted merchant vessels that, whatever their other virtues, were not the equal of purpose-built warships in a straight gunnery duel. The English also had something that the Dutch Confederate system made difficult to achieve: unified command. The Commonwealth Navy was administered centrally by a Navy board of considerable competence, and its admirals reported to a single political authority rather than to 5 separate admiralties with competing priorities. The First Anglo-Dutch War of 1652–54 was the proving ground where both the strengths and weaknesses of Dutch naval organisation were exposed to clear examination. It was fought in a series of battles that stretched from the English Channel to the northern approaches of Scotland, and the cumulative experience of those battles shaped Dutch naval policy for the following 2 decades in ways that are visible, in retrospect, in every aspect of the Second and Third Wars. The first significant battle of the war, at the Downs in May 1652, was triggered by a refusal of diplomatic protocol. The Dutch Admiral Maarten Tromp failed to salute the English flag in waters that the English considered their own sovereign territory, and an English squadron under Robert Blake opened fire on the Dutch fleet. The immediate tactical engagement was inconclusive, but the political consequences were enormous. It effectively guaranteed that the sporadic commercial tensions between the two powers would escalate into full naval war. The battles that followed, Kentish Knock, Dungeness, Portland, the Gabbard, Scheveningen, form a series that illustrates the evolution of both Dutch and English tactical thinking in real time. At Kentish Knock in September 1652, the English won a decisive victory, partly because Tromp was absent, commanding a convoy escort mission, and the Dutch fleet was led by the difficult and controversial Ruyter de With, who did not have Tromp's authority with his captains. At Dungeness in November, Tromp returned and won brilliantly, using aggressive tactics to sweep the English from the Channel and reportedly clearing the way for a Dutch convoy of 500 merchant vessels through waters that should have been under English control. The Portland Battle of February 1653 was a 3-day running engagement that stretched across the English Channel as Tromp attempted to escort a convoy homeward against persistent English attacks. The logistics of the encounter were extraordinary. Tromp's fleet had to fight its way through Blake's squadron while simultaneously managing the safety of the 500 merchant vessels in his charge. He managed it, but the cost in fighting ships was high. The battle demonstrated both Tromp's genius and the structural difficulty of the Dutch strategic position. The Republic's need to protect its commerce meant that its warships were frequently tied to convoy duties, at times when concentration of force against the enemy fleet would have been tactically preferable. This tension, between the need to protect trade and the need to concentrate force against the enemy, is a recurring theme in Dutch naval history, and is one of the most interesting analytical problems it presents. The Republic's wealth came from trade. Without the trade, it could not fund the navy. Without the navy, the trade could not be protected. But the protection of trade required dispersing naval strength across convoy routes, which meant that the fighting fleet was never fully concentrated for the decisive battles that could have ended the wars more quickly and decisively. The English, whose commercial vulnerabilities were somewhat different and who were more willing to accept commercial losses in exchange for fighting effectiveness, did not face this dilemma in quite the same way. The lesson that the Dutch drew from the First War was not to abandon trade protection, but to professionalise and systematise it, to create better coordination between the fighting fleet and the convoy escort function, to standardise the procedures for assembling and managing convoys, and to build warships that were sufficiently powerful that they could serve effectively in both roles. This compromise approach was not ideal from a pure tactical standpoint, but it was, given the Republic's commercial imperatives, the only politically sustainable one. The Dutch fought the First Anglo-Dutch War with enormous courage and considerable skill, and under Tromp they won some significant victories. But the structural disadvantages told. The Republic could not sustain the attrition rate of full naval war against a power with England's shipbuilding capacity. When peace was negotiated in 1654, it was not a Dutch triumph. The Republic had to make significant concessions, but the Dutch learned. In the decade between the First and Second Anglo-Dutch Wars, the Republic undertook a systematic overhaul of its navy. The 5 admiralties were not merged. The political structure of the Confederation made that impossible, but their activities were better coordinated. New, purpose-built warships were constructed to the largest specifications the Dutch yards could manage. The doctrine of the line of battle, fighting in a coordinated single file, each ship supporting its neighbours, was studied and improved. Officers were evaluated more rigorously. The lessons of the First War were absorbed with the kind of systematic attention to improvement that characterised the best of Dutch commercial practice. When the Second Anglo-Dutch War began in 1665, the Republic was significantly better prepared than it had been in 1652. The Second War was triggered, as the First had been, by English commercial aggression, specifically by the English seizure of the Dutch colony of New Amsterdam, which would be renamed New York in 1664, and by a series of English attacks on Dutch trading posts in West Africa. The English under Charles II were confident that they could repeat the relative success of the First War and force further commercial concessions from the Republic. They were wrong, and the reason they were wrong had a name: Michiel de Ruyter. De Ruyter had been given command of the Dutch fleet, and what he showed in the Second Anglo-Dutch War was a level of operational and strategic sophistication that the English had not anticipated and found very difficult to match. He was aided by the intervention of France, which had allied with the Republic against England. But the French naval contribution, while politically significant, was militarily modest. The decisive factor was de Ruyter himself and the fleet he had shaped. The Second Anglo-Dutch War produced one of the most spectacular moments in naval history: the Dutch raid on the Medway in June 1667, an operation of breathtaking audacity that struck directly at the heart of English naval power and produced a peace settlement markedly more favourable to the Dutch than anyone in England had imagined possible at the war's outset. But before the Medway, there was a battle of a different and even more astonishing kind. To understand why the Medway raid was so shattering, not merely militarily but psychologically, it helps to understand what the English fleet meant to England in the 1660s. England had emerged from its civil war and the Cromwellian years with a restored monarchy and a court at Whitehall that was consciously performing confidence and splendour. Charles II understood theatre. His navy was part of that theatre. The great ships, the Royal Charles, the Royal James, the Sovereign of the Seas with her gilded carvings, were not merely weapons, they were statements. They announced that England was a power of the first rank, that the Republic of merchants across the North Sea should not mistake English patience for English weakness. Samuel Pepys, the naval administrator whose diaries give us our most intimate window into the England of this period, felt a genuine thrill when he walked the docks at Chatham and watched the great ships being fitted out. These vessels represented investment, employment, national prestige, and the promise that English commerce would be protected. They were among the largest and most complex objects that 17th century civilization could produce, which made what the Dutch did to them in the early summer of 1667 so devastating in its effects on the English imagination. The plan was the work of Johan de Witt, the Grand Pensionary of Holland, and of Admiral de Ruyter, drawing on intelligence gathered by Dutch agents who had monitored English naval readiness throughout the winter. England, exhausted by the war's costs and battered by the Great Plague of 1665 and the Great Fire of 1666, had laid up many of its largest warships at Chatham on the River Medway, behind a great chain that stretched across the river and was guarded by shore fortifications. The English believed this arrangement adequate. The Dutch believed otherwise. The Dutch fleet approached the Thames estuary in early June with fireships, shallow draft vessels capable of navigating the Medway's tricky waters and landing troops to silence shore batteries. The operation required exceptional coordination and piloting skill. On the 11th of June, the Dutch broke the great chain. On the 12th, they pushed deeper into the river. On the 13th, they reached the heart of the anchorage and set fire to the Royal James, the Royal Oak, and the Royal London, three of the most powerful warships in the English fleet. Then, in an act of almost theatrical humiliation, they took the Royal Charles II's own flagship, and towed it back to the Netherlands. The carved coat of arms from the Royal Charles's stern, showing the English royal arms in all their heraldic glory, was removed and put on display. It remains in the Rijksmuseum in Amsterdam to this day, a piece of English wood, carved by English craftsmen to glorify an English king, sitting in the Dutch National Museum as a reminder of a summer fortnight in 1667, when the Republic reached into the heart of English power and took what it wanted. Pepys recorded the response of Londoners in diary entries among the most distressed he ever wrote. The sound of Dutch guns could be heard in London. There was panic. There was a run on the banks. Men loaded their valuables onto carts and prepared to flee. Pepys himself buried his gold and his most important papers in his garden. The psychological impact was immense, not because the Dutch had won a sea battle, but because they had demonstrated that English home waters were not safe, that English power had real limits, and that the Republic of Merchants was a genuinely formidable adversary capable of striking at will. The Peace of Breda, signed in late July 1667, reflected the new reality. The Dutch recovered Suriname and several other territories. The English kept New Amsterdam, now New York, which would prove, in the long run, to be one of the most consequential territorial exchanges in history. But the terms were far more favourable to the Dutch than anyone in London had expected, and the reason for that shift was the blackened hulks of the Royal James and the Royal Oak, and the memory of Dutch guns echoing across the Thames marshes on a June morning when England discovered that its confidence had been built on shakier foundations than it had imagined. But we're getting ahead of ourselves. Before the Medway, there was the 4 days' battle. On the morning of the 1st of June, 1666, two of the largest fleets ever assembled in the history of sail came within sight of each other in the North Sea, off the coast of the English county of Suffolk. The Dutch fleet, commanded by Michiel de Ruyter, consisted of approximately 84 warships mounting around 4,000 guns. The English fleet, commanded by General George Monk, the Duke of Albemarle, was, through a strategic miscalculation by King Charles II, substantially reduced in number. A significant portion of the English fleet had been detached to intercept a supposed French squadron that turned out to be nowhere near its expected position. Monk, with somewhere between 50 and 60 ships, faced de Ruyter's full strength. What followed over the next 4 days, from the 1st of June through the 4th, was the longest naval battle in the history of sail. It was a sustained, grinding, often brutal engagement in which the two fleets fought each other into exhaustion, in smoke so dense that ships sometimes could not tell whether the ship they were firing at was friend or enemy, in conditions of wind and weather that shifted constantly and required both commanders to remake their tactical calculations every few hours. The first day began with an English attack. Monk, characteristically aggressive, chose to strike at de Ruyter's fleet despite being outnumbered rather than wait for the return of his detached squadrons. The fighting was intense from the beginning. The Dutch had the weather gauge, the advantageous upwind position, and used it effectively, preventing the English from closing to the very short ranges at which English gunnery was most effective and using their own superior numbers to envelop the English fleet on both flanks. De Ruyter's tactical management of the battle over 4 days was a masterpiece of sustained operational command under conditions of extreme stress and complexity. The challenges he faced were formidable. Coordinating 84 ships in conditions of restricted visibility and changing wind was an extraordinary logistical achievement, even before accounting for the presence of an active and aggressive enemy. Communications were limited to signal flags and cannon shots. There was no radio, no telephone, no way to quickly convey complex instructions to ships at the far end of the line. De Ruyter managed this through a combination of pre-battle briefings, clear signal codes, and the cultivation of subordinate commanders who understood his intentions well enough to act without explicit orders. The Dutch signal system itself was a significant innovation. The Dutch had developed a more sophisticated system of signal flags than most contemporary navies, allowing admirals to convey a wider range of instructions to their captains. This was not a trivial advantage in battle, where the ability to communicate even simple instructions quickly and reliably could be the difference between a fleet that responded coherently to a tactical opportunity and one that reacted in fragments. By the end of the first day, Monk had lost several ships and many men, but his fleet was still fighting, and he had managed to inflict significant casualties on the Dutch as well. The second day saw the English reinforced by the return of some of their detached ships under the command of Prince Rupert, which equalised the numbers somewhat and gave Monk renewed confidence. The fighting on the second and third days was even fiercer than on the first, closer, more confused, with both fleets periodically disengaging to repair damage before plunging back into contact. The English fleet suffered particularly from the Dutch practice of targeting masts and rigging rather than hulls, a tactical choice that reflected the Dutch preference for disabling enemy ships rather than sinking them outright, which preserved the possibility of capturing them as prizes. A ship whose masts had been shot away could not manoeuvre, could not escape, and was enormously vulnerable to boarding. Several significant English ships were captured or destroyed in this manner during the 4 days' battle. The fourth day was the decisive one. Monk, his fleet battered and reduced, attempted a fighting retreat toward the English coast, hoping to reach shallow water where the larger Dutch ships could not easily follow. De Ruyter pursued aggressively, using his superior numbers to keep pressure on the retreating English and preventing them from disengaging cleanly. In the final hours of the battle, the English fleet's cohesion broke down under the sustained Dutch pressure, and individual ships became separated from the main body and were taken or destroyed. When it was over, the accounting was grim for the English. They had lost 20 ships, including several first-rate men of war. 8,000 English sailors were killed, wounded, or captured. Monk's fleet, which had gone into battle as one of the finest fighting forces afloat, had been effectively broken as a coherent fighting force and would require weeks of repair and rebuilding before it could take the sea again. The Dutch losses were also significant. 4 ships lost, about 2,000 men killed or wounded, but de Ruyter's fleet remained a functioning, combat-ready force at the battle's end, which was the critical difference. The 4 days' battle was the greatest Dutch naval victory in a war full of significant Dutch victories. It demonstrated definitively that the Dutch Republic could not only compete with England at sea, but could defeat England in a straight fleet-on-fleet battle under open sea conditions, not in the shallow coastal waters where the Dutch had natural advantages, but in the open North Sea, in a sustained multi-day engagement that tested every aspect of naval power: ship quality, gunnery, tactics, leadership, logistics, and morale. But the Battle of the 4 Days, extraordinary as it was not the end of the Second Anglo-Dutch War's most remarkable chapter. That came the following year, on the River Medway, and it was audacity of a completely different kind. In June 1667, with the war having ground on inconclusively for months after the Dutch victory in the 4 days' battle, the Republic decided to strike directly at the English fleet's home base. English ships laid up for the winter were moored in the River Medway at Chatham, behind a defensive chain stretched across the river and guarded by shore batteries. The conventional wisdom was that the Medway anchorage was safe. The chain, the guns, and the river's navigational difficulties made it effectively impregnable. Admiral Cornelis de Witt, with a fleet under the operational command of Vice Admiral Jan de Liefde and the practical navigation expertise of the pilot Peter Visch, who had first-hand knowledge of the Medway's channels, broke through the chain on the 12th of June using a small vessel packed with combustibles to burn through the links. Dutch warships poured through the gap. English defenders fled in panic. The Dutch burned or captured several of the most important ships in the English Navy, including the Royal Charles, Charles II's own flagship, which they towed back to the Netherlands as a trophy. The Royal Charles's stern carvings were displayed in the Rijksmuseum in Amsterdam, where they can still be seen today. The psychological impact in England was severe. Samuel Pepys, the naval administrator and famous diarist who had been following the war's fortunes obsessively, wrote that the Medway raid was the worst defeat England had suffered in its history. The peace treaty that followed, the Treaty of Breda, negotiated in the summer of 1667, was decidedly favourable to the Dutch. The Navigation Act was modified in ways that benefited Dutch commerce, and New Amsterdam, which England had seized before the war, remained English, but the Dutch retained Suriname, which they had captured, and several other colonial acquisitions that more than offset the loss. The raid on the Medway stands as perhaps the most audacious single naval operation the Dutch ever executed. It required intelligence, careful planning, precise navigation in difficult waters, and the courage to strike at what everyone believed was an impregnable target. It succeeded completely, and its success demonstrated that Dutch naval genius was not limited to the tactical management of fleet battles, but extended to the strategic level, the ability to identify the enemy's most vulnerable point and strike it with concentrated, unexpected force. It was a lesson that naval commanders would study for generations. While the dramatic fleet actions of the Anglo-Dutch wars were playing out in the North Sea and the English Channel, the Dutch were fighting equally consequential naval campaigns on the other side of the world, in the warm waters of the Indian Ocean and the South China Sea. These campaigns, less famous in European historical memory, were just as impressive in their operational scope and just as decisive in their strategic consequences, and they demonstrated that Dutch naval capability was not a local or regional phenomenon, but a genuinely global one. When the Dutch first arrived in Asian waters in the 1590s, the Portuguese had been there for nearly a century. The Portuguese Estado de India, the State of India as they called their Asian empire, was a network of fortified trading posts, naval bases, and controlled sea lanes that stretched from Mozambique on the East African coast to Macau on the South China coast, connected by armed vessels that collected duties from all, shipping and enforced Portuguese commercial privileges by force. It was the first true seaborne empire in history, and at the height of its power in the mid-16th century, it was a formidable structure. By the time the Dutch arrived, however, the Portuguese position was already showing signs of strain. The empire was understaffed. Portugal was a small country, and sustaining a global military and commercial empire stretched its human resources to the limit. It was overstretched geographically. The sea lanes it was trying to control were simply too long and too numerous for the forces available. And it had acquired enemies, because decades of monopolistic behaviour, backed by violence, had alienated virtually every Asian polity with which it had come into contact. The Dutch recognised all of this and exploited it with characteristic systematic intelligence. They began by gathering information, detailed accounts from Portuguese sources, from pilots who had sailed the routes, from merchants who had traded in the region. The Dutch were voracious collectors of geographic and navigational knowledge. One of the VOC's first systematic investments was the compilation of accurate charts and sailing directions for the waters it intended to operate in, correcting and improving on the Portuguese originals where possible. The famous Dutch cartographic tradition, the Blauw atlases, the great charts produced by Amsterdam publishers, was not merely a commercial enterprise but a strategic one. Knowledge of where the rocks were, where the currents ran, which season was safe for sailing in which waters, this was power, and the Dutch accumulated it methodically. The first major Dutch naval success in Asian waters came at Bantam in 1601, where a Dutch squadron defeated a Portuguese fleet attempting to drive the Dutch from their trading position on the northwest coast of Java. The Dutch victory was achieved partly through superior gunnery and partly through the support of local rulers who preferred Dutch trade, which came without the aggressive missionary pressure that characterised Portuguese commercial relations to the Portuguese alternative. The pattern established at Bantam was repeated across the next 2 decades. The Dutch identified key nodes in the Portuguese trading network, not all of them, which would have required more force than the VOC could assemble, but the most critical ones, and attacked them systematically. Ambon in the Maluku Islands fell to the Dutch in 1605. Tidore followed. Banda, after the terrible campaign against its indigenous population in 1621, became a Dutch-controlled island. The Portuguese trading post at Malacca, the great entrepot at the tip of the Malay Peninsula through which much of the trade between the Indian Ocean and the South China Sea flowed, fell to a Dutch assault in 1641. The Portuguese in Asia had developed a sophisticated system of naval control that the Dutch had to study carefully before they could dismantle it effectively. The Portuguese Cartaz system, the requirement that all ships trading in the Indian Ocean carry a Portuguese-issued license and pay a duty at Portuguese ports, was enforced by a network of war galleasses and armed roundships stationed at strategic points along the major trade routes. Ships that attempted to trade without a Cartaz were seized or destroyed. The system was less a free market trading empire than it was a protection racket on an oceanic scale, and it had been generating substantial revenue for the Portuguese crown for nearly a century when the Dutch first arrived. The Dutch approach to defeating this system was methodical and carefully sequenced. They did not attempt to challenge the Portuguese everywhere at once. Instead, they identified the nodes in the Portuguese network that were most critical and most vulnerable, and they attacked those specifically, building a parallel network of their own as they went. The port of Bantam on the northwest coast of Java was identified early as a critical staging point. It lay at the western end of the Sunda Strait, the alternative route to the Maluku Islands that bypassed Portuguese-controlled Malacca. By establishing a strong presence at Bantam, the Dutch could operate in the eastern archipelago without passing through the Portuguese checkpoint at Malacca. The Portuguese response to the Dutch intrusion was vigorous but ultimately ineffective. They attempted to form alliances with local rulers who had reason to distrust the Dutch, and there were many such rulers, particularly after Cohen's brutal campaigns in the Banda Islands. But the Portuguese position was consistently undermined by the fact that the VOC could offer commercial terms, backed by reliable military force, that the declining Estado da India could not match. The Portuguese were running their Asian empire with diminishing resources and increasing corruption. They were losing the administrative and logistical coherence that had made them effective a century earlier. The Dutch caught them at exactly the right moment of relative weakness, and they exploited it with a ruthlessness that the Portuguese themselves would have recognized and respected. The capture of Malacca in 1641 was the culmination of a 20-year campaign of strategic encirclement. The Dutch had been systematically cutting off Portuguese supply lines and alliances for 2 decades before the final siege. They had negotiated agreements with the Sultan of Johor and other Malay rulers that isolated Malacca politically. They had established their own trading posts and fortifications at points that gave them logistical control of the surrounding waters. When the final assault came, it came against a position that had been weakened, isolated and demoralized by years of sustained pressure. The actual siege was brutal and costly, but its outcome was never seriously in doubt. Against the Spanish, who controlled the Philippines and operated a significant naval presence in the Western Pacific, the Dutch fought a series of engagements that demonstrated the Republic's ability to project naval power across enormous distances. A Dutch squadron under the command of Oliver van Noort circumnavigated the globe between 1598 and 1601. The first Dutch circumnavigation, and only the second successful circumnavigation in history. His fleet engaged Spanish ships in the Philippines, establishing that the Dutch were willing and able to challenge Spanish power in its own most distant preserve. The Dutch victory in the Indian Ocean and the South Asian archipelago was not, ultimately, a triumph of superior courage or even of superior technology. The Portuguese and the Dutch were at roughly similar technological levels. It was a triumph of organisation and finance. The VOC's joint stock structure gave it resources and planning horizons that the Estado de India, funded ultimately from the Portuguese royal treasury through a bureaucratic system of growing inefficiency, could not match. The Dutch could absorb losses and continue investing for the long term in ways that the Portuguese system could not sustain. And the Dutch commercial model attracted more voluntary cooperation from Asian trading partners who had genuine choices to make. But the naval achievement remains extraordinary. The Dutch Republic, in the first half of the 17th century, established itself as the dominant maritime power in Asian waters, displacing the Portuguese from positions they had held for a century, and establishing a commercial military order that would persist, in various forms, until the 19th century. It did this through a combination of superior financial organisation, systematic intelligence gathering, consistent investment in naval power, and the tactical and operational skill of commanders who were fighting at the end of supply lines that stretched nearly halfway around the world. One of the persistent puzzles of Dutch naval history for students who come to it without an economic background is this: where did the money come from? The Dutch Republic was a small country with limited agricultural resources, no significant deposits of iron or timber, and a population that was, throughout the 17th century, smaller than England's and vastly smaller than France's or Spain's. Yet it maintained, simultaneously, a competitive European navy, a global trading empire backed by armed force, and one of the most sophisticated commercial economies the world had yet produced. The economics of all this deserve careful examination, because the economics were, in many respects, the most genuinely innovative thing about the Dutch achievement. The foundation was trade. Not just any trade, but the systematic domination of the highest value, highest volume trade routes in the world. The Baltic grain and timber trade, the Asian spice trade, the textile trade between England and the continent, the slave trade across the Atlantic, the sugar trade from Brazil and the Caribbean. The Dutch were not everywhere at once, but they were strategically positioned in the most important commercial nodes, and they extracted value from those positions with remarkable efficiency. The VOC dividend is the most striking illustration of how this worked. In the years between 1630 and 1670, the peak of Dutch commercial dominance, the VOC regularly paid dividends to its shareholders of between 15 and 25% of the original share price. These were not small or speculative investments, being rewarded with occasional exceptional returns. These were sustained, predictable profits from the systematic control of trade routes that produced goods for which there was inelastic demand across Europe. Spices were not a luxury in the 17th century in the way they are today. They were essential for food preservation, medicine, and the management of the smells and tastes of food in an era before refrigeration. People who could afford them would pay almost any price for them. Control of the supply of spices was, in economic terms, control of an essential good with no near substitute and highly price-inelastic demand. The profits were extraordinary and sustained. These profits were reinvested through the Amsterdam exchange and banking system in ways that amplified their effect. The Amsterdam Exchange Bank, founded in 1609, provided stable credit at low interest rates. The interest rates in Amsterdam were significantly lower than in London, Paris, or any other financial centre in Europe, because the bank maintained strict reserves and rigorous accounting and was perceived by investors as essentially risk-free. This meant that Dutch merchants and the Dutch government could borrow money more cheaply than their rivals, which gave them a structural financial advantage that was as important as any tactical advantage in battle. The Dutch government, the States General and the provincial estates, particularly the estates of Holland, which provided the majority of the Republic's revenues, was unusually sophisticated in its management of public finance. It issued bonds regularly to fund naval and military expenditures, and these bonds were considered extremely safe investments, safer than the obligations of any monarch in Europe, because the Dutch political system made default difficult in ways that the personal credit of a king did not. A king could simply refuse to pay his debts. A democratic government whose creditors were also its citizens and voters found this considerably harder. The result was that the Dutch Republic could borrow money to fund naval expansion at interest rates of around 4%, while Spain was paying 8% or more and frequently defaulting on its obligations entirely. Over the long term, this difference in borrowing cost was enormously significant. It meant that the Republic could sustain a naval war for longer, rebuild faster after defeats, and invest more consistently in the maintenance and improvement of its fleet than a power that was paying twice as much for the same money. The shipbuilding industry was another area where Dutch economic organisation produced structural advantages. The yards at Zaandam and elsewhere operated at a scale and with a degree of standardisation that allowed them to produce warships faster and more cheaply than comparable yards in England or France. The availability of Baltic timber, imported through the Dutch-dominated Baltic trade, ensured that the Republic was never short of the raw materials for shipbuilding, even though it produced virtually no timber itself. The skilled labour force available in Dutch port cities, carpenters, sailmakers, rope makers, gun founders, instrument makers, was the deepest and most experienced in Europe, a product of the Republic's long engagement with the maritime economy. Marine insurance was another financial innovation with profound implications for naval power. The underwriting community in Amsterdam developed the most sophisticated marine insurance market in the world during the 17th century, with standardized policy forms, actuarial assessment of risks, and the capacity to underwrite voyages of any value and any destination. This market allowed Dutch merchants to take risks that would have been commercially suicidal without insurance coverage, and it meant that the loss of individual ships, even valuable ones, did not threaten the stability of the commercial enterprises that underpinned the Republic's naval power. The relationship between commercial wealth and naval power was not simply that one funded the other, though that was certainly true. It was more intimate and more complex than that. The Dutch merchant marine was the Navy's reserve, not in an abstract military sense, but in the concrete practical sense that the Republic could, in times of war, convert merchant vessels to armed service, requisition experienced merchant sailors to serve as naval crews, and draw on the logistical and technical infrastructure of the commercial maritime economy to support naval operations. The line between the merchant fleet and the Navy was more permeable in the Dutch case than in the English or French cases, and this permeability was a significant military advantage. The Dutch Baltic trade is particularly worth examining as an example of how commercial dominance translated into strategic advantage. The Baltic region was the primary source of the naval stores: timber, tar, hemp for rope, flax for sailcloth, that all European navies required to function. A power that controlled Baltic trade controlled, in a meaningful sense, the supply chain of European naval warfare. The Dutch, by dominating the carrying trade through the Danish Sound, were in a position to influence the availability of these materials to other powers, not through explicit embargo, but through the simple fact that Dutch merchants were the intermediaries through whom other nations accessed Baltic supply. This commercial position gave the Republic a kind of strategic leverage that was distinct from its military leverage but complementary to it. Countries that wanted to build navies, or to maintain the navies they had, needed Dutch trade to function. This created a web of economic interdependencies that worked, in subtle but persistent ways, to protect Dutch commercial interests even in periods of political tension. The wealth generated by trade also funded something that was, in the long run, as important as warships or admirals: the scientific and technical culture that produced navigational and cartographic innovation. The Dutch were the leading producers of accurate charts and navigational instruments in the 17th century. Dutch lens makers and instrument manufacturers, working in the same commercial environment that would eventually produce Antonie van Leeuwenhoek and his microscope, supplied the tools of precision navigation to sailors across Europe. This technical excellence was not incidental to Dutch maritime dominance. It was one of its foundations. There is a temptation, when looking at the Dutch commercial achievement, to present it as something like a pure market story, a tale of enterprise and innovation rewarded by prosperity and power. That temptation should be resisted. The Dutch commercial empire was built on coercion as much as on trade, on monopoly as much as on competition, and on the labour and resources of people who had no meaningful voice in the terms on which they participated in the Dutch economic order. The enslaved people who produced sugar in Dutch colonies, the indigenous communities who were forced out of their traditional economic relationships by VOC monopoly systems, the Asian populations who lived under Dutch military governance. These are part of the story too. But the economic achievement, for all its moral complexity, was real and consequential. The Dutch Republic found a way to generate and sustain naval power that was, given its size and resources, historically unprecedented. It did so not through superior raw resources, but through superior organisation, superior financial infrastructure, and superior commercial intelligence. Naval warfare in the 17th century was, by the standards of later centuries, extremely primitive in its communications and extremely sophisticated in its demands on commanders. There was no radio, no telegraph, no way to pass complex instructions to a ship more than visual signal distance away. In the smoke and noise of battle, visual signals were often impossible to read. Commanders had to plan their battles in advance, briefing their captains on contingencies and intentions, and then trusting those captains to act correctly without further guidance. In these conditions, the clarity and creativity of tactical thinking before the battle and the quality of subordinate commanders during it were the determining factors in naval success. The Dutch contribution to the development of naval tactics in the 17th century was substantial, and has not always received the recognition it deserves, partly because the English navy of the later 17th and 18th centuries built on and extended Dutch innovations in ways that made the Dutch originals seem like rough drafts of something the English later perfected. But the Dutch originals were genuinely important, and understanding them is essential to understanding how de Ruyter and his colleagues were able to achieve what they did. The most fundamental tactical innovation of the period was the line of battle, the arrangement of a fleet in a single file, each ship following the next, so that all ships could simultaneously fire their broadsides at the enemy without the risk of hitting friendly vessels. This arrangement maximised a fleet's total firepower while simplifying the command and control problem. A captain in line only needed to follow the ship ahead of him and maintain his station, rather than independently managing his position relative to every other ship in the fleet. The line of battle is often credited to the English, and specifically to the fighting instructions issued by the Commonwealth and later the Restoration Navy. But the Dutch were developing similar ideas simultaneously, and the tactical dialogues between Dutch and English naval thinking, sometimes through direct conflict, sometimes through the studied observation of enemy practice, sometimes through the capture and examination of enemy signal books, were a two-way street. The Dutch developed their own signal systems and tactical doctrines that were in some respects more flexible than the English ones, which became famously rigid in the later 17th and early 18th centuries, producing disasters like the Battle of Beachy Head in 1690. Dutch signals were, throughout the period of the Anglo-Dutch Wars, more sophisticated than they are usually given credit for being. The Dutch had developed a set of standard signals using flag combinations that could convey a range of tactical instructions, not just the basic orders like attack or retreat or form line, but more nuanced communications like shift the attack to the enemy's centre, or use fire ships on the flagships, or each ship engage its nearest opponent independently. This flexibility in communication gave Dutch commanders options that commanders with cruder signal systems did not have, and it meant that Dutch battle plans could include contingencies and alternatives that could be activated by signal during the battle itself. The Dutch use of fire ships was particularly sophisticated and deserves extended treatment. A fire ship was a vessel, usually an old or expendable ship, filled with combustible materials and rigged with grappling hooks designed to catch in an enemy ship's rigging. The fire ship's crew would light the combustibles, set the helm to steer toward a target, and then abandon ship in small boats, leaving the burning vessel to drift toward the enemy. If a fire ship successfully reached an enemy warship and the grappling hooks caught, the result was almost always the destruction of both vessels. Fire ships were not a Dutch invention. They had been used in naval warfare since antiquity, and the most famous use of fire ships in English history, against the Spanish Armada at Gravelines in 1588, predated the Dutch Golden Age. But the Dutch refined and systematized the use of fire ships in ways that made them a genuinely strategic weapon rather than a tactical improvisation. They designated specific ships for fire ship duty and prepared them in advance with standardized combustible loads and rigging configurations. They developed tactical doctrines for the use of fire ships in combination with conventional warships, using conventional vessels to pin enemy ships in position, while fire ships were maneuvered into attack position. And they used fire ships at both the tactical and the strategic level, as in the Medway raid, where fire ships played a central role in destroying or disabling major English warships. The Dutch also made significant contributions to gunnery practice and ship armament. The question of how to arm a warship, how many guns, what calibre, at what height above the waterline, was one that occupied naval architects and tacticians throughout the period. The Dutch made a distinctive choice, favoured by their tactical circumstances. They tended to favour guns that fired more frequently over guns that fired heavier shot. The reasoning was that in the kind of fighting that Dutch admirals preferred, aggressive, manoeuvring, seeking to disable rather than sink enemy vessels, rate of fire mattered more than raw destructive power per shot. This was not a universally correct tactical choice. In different circumstances, heavier guns were preferable, but it was a considered, intelligent choice that reflected a coherent tactical philosophy. The Dutch approach to fighting at sea was always more about manoeuvring and disabling than about sheer destructive power, and their armament reflected this preference. The training and quality of Dutch naval crews deserves separate attention. The Republic's long tradition of maritime commerce meant that the pool of men available for naval service was exceptionally experienced. A Dutch sailor who entered naval service in the mid-17th century had typically spent years at sea in commercial service, handling ships in the demanding waters of the North Sea, the Baltic, and often far beyond. He was not a soldier who happened to be on a ship. He was a sailor by profession and culture, with skills in seamanship, navigation, and the handling of sails and rigging that were deeply ingrained and continuously practiced. This professionalism showed in battle. Dutch crews could manage their ships in difficult conditions, in fog, in shallow water, in changing winds, with a confidence and competence that crews from less maritime societies could not easily match. They could manoeuvre quickly when the tactical situation demanded it, exploit a sudden shift in wind that a less alert crew would have missed, or bring a ship about rapidly to deliver a broadside at a moment when the target was momentarily exposed. These are not skills that can be acquired quickly or taught in the abstract. They are accumulated through years of practice and experience, and the Dutch naval system had a uniquely deep reservoir of them to draw on. There is one more dimension of Dutch society that deserves explicit attention in connection to naval capability, and that is the relationship between Dutch intellectual culture and maritime practice. The 17th century Dutch Republic was, by the standards of its time, an extraordinarily open intellectual environment. The combination of religious tolerance, a commercially oriented culture that valued practical knowledge, a highly literate population, and a printing and publishing industry that was the most prolific and least censored in Europe created conditions in which ideas could circulate, compete, and develop with unusual freedom. This intellectual openness had direct consequences for maritime and naval capability. The Dutch were early enthusiasts for the new science, the observational, experimental approach to natural knowledge that Galileo was developing in Italy. Dutch scientists and instrument makers were at the cutting edge of the development of the telescope, the microscope, and precision measuring instruments of all kinds. Christian Huygens invented the pendulum clock, the most accurate timepiece of the 17th century. Antony van Leeuwenhoek, a draper with no formal scientific training, used Dutch optical technology to become the first person to observe bacteria. These achievements were products of a cultural and institutional environment that valued precision, observation, and practical knowledge in ways that fostered scientific development. For navigation, this mattered enormously. The development of longitude measurement occupied Dutch as well as English scientific minds for the entire 17th century. Dutch efforts in this direction produced improvements in astronomical observation and calculation that improved Dutch navigational accuracy and therefore Dutch maritime efficiency. The Dutch also produced, during this period, a body of maritime law and international legal theory that influenced the governance of the seas for centuries. Hugo Grotius produced his seminal work Mare Liberum, or The Freedom of the Seas, in 1609. Grotius argued that the sea could not be owned by any nation, and that all nations had the right to trade freely across the world's oceans. This argument was, transparently, in the commercial interest of the Dutch Republic, which depended on free ocean trade for its prosperity, but it was also a genuinely influential piece of legal reasoning that shaped the development of international maritime law, and that its echoes are still audible in modern international law of the sea. All of these elements, tactical doctrine, signals, gunnery, crew quality, navigation, intellectual culture, were not independent variables that happened to be simultaneously good in the Dutch case. They were elements of an integrated system, each one reinforcing and depending on the others, that added up to a naval capability greater than the sum of its parts. The Dutch Navy worked well not because any single element was dramatically superior to the competition, but because all the elements were good and because they fit together into a coherent, well-practiced whole. This is perhaps the deepest lesson of Dutch naval success, that organisational coherence and systemic integration are worth as much as individual technical or tactical superiority. The Dutch were rarely the best in any single dimension of naval capability. They were consistently very good in all of them, and those consistent competencies, combined and aligned, added up to something that larger and apparently more powerful opponents found very difficult to beat. No golden age lasts forever, and the Dutch one was no exception. By the end of the 17th century, the forces that had made Dutch maritime supremacy possible were beginning to erode, and the forces that would eventually displace it were gathering strength in ways that the Republic could perhaps see but could not prevent. The process of decline was gradual and contested, not sudden or complete. Even as English and French naval power grew and began to match and then exceed Dutch capability, the Republic remained a significant maritime power, one of the most significant in the world. The decline was relative, not absolute. The Dutch Navy of 1700 was arguably stronger in absolute terms than the Dutch Navy of 1650, but the English Navy of 1700 was enormously stronger than the English Navy of 1650, and that disparity in rate of growth is what mattered. The turning point is usually identified as the Third Anglo-Dutch War, which lasted from 1672 to 1674. This war was fundamentally different from the first two in its political character. It was not primarily a commercial dispute between two Protestant maritime powers, as the first two wars had been. It was an attempt by Louis XIV of France, in alliance with Charles II of England, to destroy the Dutch Republic entirely, to occupy its territory, dismember its commercial empire, and eliminate it as a significant European power. The scale of the assault was unprecedented. A French army of 120,000 men crossed the Rhine in June 1672 and overran most of the Dutch territory in weeks. The year 1672 is known in Dutch history simply as Het Rampjaar, the disaster year. The Republic survived the disaster year, but only barely, and only through a combination of flooding its own territory again, the old defensive strategy from the earliest days of the revolt against Spain, and the political revolution that brought William III of Orange to power as stadholder, displacing the De Witt brothers who had governed the Republic for 20 years. Johan de Witt and his brother Cornelis were lynched by a mob in The Hague in August 1672, a shocking act of political violence that stands as one of the most disturbing episodes in Dutch Golden Age history. At sea, de Ruyter fought the Third War brilliantly. Despite the collapse of the Dutch land position, he kept the combined English and French fleet out of the crucial Dutch ports and coastal waters, winning a series of engagements that prevented the naval dimension of the assault from achieving its objectives. His campaigns in 1672 and 1673, against a combined enemy force that outnumbered him significantly, are considered by naval historians to be among the finest defensive operations in the history of sail. But even de Ruyter could not reverse the overall strategic situation. He could only limit the damage. De Ruyter died in April 1676, not in the North Sea but in the Mediterranean. William III had sent the Dutch fleet to assist Spain against France in the waters off Sicily and at the Battle of Syracuse, fighting on behalf of a war that had little to do with Dutch commercial interests and a great deal to do with William's European political ambitions. De Ruyter was struck by a cannonball and died 4 days later. He was 69 years old. The Republic that had given him a ropemaker's son's start in life buried him with the honours of a national hero in the Nieuwe Kerk in Amsterdam, where his ornate tomb remains today, guarded by marble figures representing victory and death in an almost theatrical piece of Baroque commemoration. The death of de Ruyter was, in a way, symbolic of a broader transition. The Republic was changing. The mercantile Republic that had built its power on trade and commerce was becoming, under William III and his successors, more entangled in European land power politics, more oriented toward continental coalitions and armies rather than sea power and commercial dominance. William took the throne of England in 1688 to 89 in the Glorious Revolution, which united English and Dutch resources against France, but also effectively merged the two maritime powers in a way that gradually shifted the primary burden of a naval competition with France from the Netherlands to England. The Republic also faced structural economic challenges that went beyond politics. The intensive capital investment required to maintain both a competitive navy and a global commercial empire was straining the Republic's resources. The interest rates on Dutch public debt, which had been extraordinarily low in the mid-17th century and had been a key competitive advantage, were rising as the debt load grew. The commercial margins on key trades were narrowing as competition increased. The VOC, while still enormously profitable on paper, was beginning to show the signs of institutional sclerosis that would eventually bring it to bankruptcy at the end of the 18th century. Other powers were also learning. The English Navy, which had been decisively beaten by de Ruyter in the 1660s, undertook a sustained programme of reform and investment that by the 1680s had produced a fighting force that was, in most respects, the equal of the Dutch, and in some respects superior. The French Navy, under the administration of Jean-Baptiste Colbert, was rebuilt from near nothing in the 1660s into a genuinely powerful force by the 1670s and 1680s. These were not static targets that the Dutch could expect to maintain permanent advantage over. They were dynamic institutions that were studying Dutch methods and investing Dutch style in naval power. The Republic's commercial model was also being challenged and adapted by its rivals. The English Navigation Acts, for all the diplomatic problems they caused, were effective in building English merchant shipping at the expense of Dutch carrying trade. The French developed their own system of commercial protection and promotion. The Dutch advantage in shipping costs and commercial infrastructure, which had been so overwhelming in the early 17th century, narrowed as rivals adopted Dutch innovations and developed their own. The final significant Dutch naval action of the Golden Age period is usually identified as the Battle of Barfleur and La Hougue in 1692, where a combined Dutch-English fleet defeated the French fleet that was attempting to support a Jacobite invasion of England. The Dutch contingent in this battle fought with distinction, but it was very clearly a supporting role in what was primarily an English naval operation. The centre of gravity of Anglo-Dutch maritime power had shifted, and it would not shift back. Yet it would be wrong to describe Dutch decline as failure. What the Republic had achieved in the century between the 1580s and the 1680s was simply extraordinary. A nation of perhaps 2 million people, ruling territory that would fit inside the state of West Virginia, had built the largest merchant fleet in the world, established a global commercial empire stretching from Suriname to Ceylon to Nagasaki, consistently defeated the naval forces of Spain, Portugal and England in pitched battles, and sustained this achievement across multiple generations and through repeated existential military and political crises. The Dutch model, moreover, did not disappear. It was absorbed and extended. The financial innovations developed in Amsterdam, the joint stock company, the exchange bank, the insurance market, the bond market, the commodity futures market, migrated to London, where they formed the basis of the financial system that would underpin British imperial expansion in the 18th and 19th centuries. The Dutch approach to naval power, systematic investment, commercial underpinning, professional officer corps, continuous tactical development, became the template that the English Navy adopted and refined. When Britain became the dominant naval power in the 18th century, it was in large part because it had successfully adopted and improved upon the Dutch model. The charts that Dutch cartographers drew, the sea atlases, the coastal surveys, the hydrographic measurements, remained in use for generations, providing the navigational foundation on which later maritime expansion was built. The ship designs that Dutch engineers developed were adapted and built upon throughout Europe. The financial instruments that Amsterdam bankers created spread across the Western world and eventually became the foundation of the modern global financial system. The Dutch Golden Age was not simply a historical episode that ended and was superseded. It was a moment of concentrated innovation, social, technological, financial, military, that permanently raised the baseline of what maritime civilization could achieve, and that left its imprint on everything that came after. And so we have arrived, as all voyages must, at the question of what it all meant. We began, tonight, in the flooded marshlands of a country that should not have existed, a nation built on reclaimed seafloor, defended by dikes, sustained by the ancient human stubbornness of people who looked at water and saw not an obstacle, but a home. We travelled through the herring fisheries and the Baltic grain routes, through the crowded counting houses of Amsterdam and the smoky hold of a fluyt loaded with spice. We met the men who redesigned the ship from the keel up, the admirals who commanded hundreds of vessels through days of cannon smoke so thick the sun disappeared, the merchants and bankers and engineers who built the financial architecture that sustained it all. We watched de Ruyter on his quarterdeck at the 4 days' battle, managing the largest fleet engagement in the history of sail with a calmness that must have seemed almost supernatural to the men around him. We saw the Dutch chain breach on the river Medway, the Royal Charles floating captive toward Dutch waters, and Samuel Pepys writing in his diary with the ink of disaster. We travelled to the Spice Islands and watched the VOC's ruthless commercial empire rise on foundations that the history of the 21st century has learned to read with more complicated eyes than the 17th century could. And we traced the long, gradual, dignified arc of Dutch decline, watching the model that had been built with such ingenuity and maintained with such effort migrate first to London and then to the world. The question that the story asks, why was the Dutch Republic able to defeat bigger empires at sea, has, in the end, not one answer, but many woven together. It was the geography that made them intimately familiar with water. It was the political system that distributed power broadly and forced consensus rather than allowing any single authority to dominate and misallocate resources. It was the financial innovation that gave them access to capital on terms no competitor could match. It was the technological innovation, from the fluyt to the standardized signal system, that continuously improved their efficiency and capability. It was the commercial culture that valued practical competence over hereditary status, that allowed a ropemaker's son to rise to command the Republic's fleet, that demanded results and rewarded them honestly. It was the sustained institutional investment in naval power over generations, not the enthusiasm of individual monarchs, but the structural commitment of a society that understood its survival depended on the sea. And it was, beneath all of this, a kind of creative relationship with adversity, the quality that the flooded polders had taught the Dutch ancestors and that their descendants carried forward into every theatre of competition they entered. The quality of looking at a situation that appears hopeless or disadvantageous and seeing, within it, the possibility of something unexpected. The quality of refusing to accept the terms that, fusing, more powerful opponents are trying to impose and insisting instead on fighting the battle differently, on different terms, in different waters, with different weapons. The Dutch Golden Age left physical traces that survive to the present day in ways that are easy to overlook if you're not specifically looking for them. The canal cities of the Netherlands, Amsterdam, Delft, Leiden, Utrecht, are still, in their physical layout and their architecture, the cities that the Golden Age built. The Rijksmuseum in Amsterdam houses not only the great paintings of the Dutch masters, Rembrandt's Night Watch, Vermeer's interiors, the vast seascapes of Willem van der Velde the Elder and the Younger, but also the actual physical artifacts of the Golden Age, the navigation instruments, the ship models, the charts, and most strikingly, the carved wooden stern panel of the Royal Charles, the English flagship that the Dutch captured during the Medway raid and brought home as a trophy of the most audacious naval operation of the century. That stern panel is an extraordinary object. It is elaborately carved with Royal English iconography, the arms of England, supporters of lion and unicorn, the Garter motto, and it was carved to be seen from the water as a declaration of English naval sovereignty over the seas. It now sits in a Dutch museum and has sat there for more than 350 years, a permanent testament to the day when Dutch sailors sailed up the River Medway and took it. You can visit it if you go to Amsterdam, and when you stand in front of it, you are standing in front of something that was physically present on the day that changed the course of Anglo-Dutch relations and reshaped the political geography of northwest Europe. The city of New Amsterdam, renamed New York by the English who took it in 1664 and kept it after the Second Anglo-Dutch War, is the most consequential of Dutch colonial legacies, though it is one that most new Yorkers carry around without thinking much about it. The street called the Broadway was a Dutch road. The wall in Wall Street was a Dutch defensive earthwork. The financial culture that made New York the commercial capital of the world in the 20th century grew, in ways that are traceable if often forgotten, from the Dutch commercial institutions that the original settlers of New Amsterdam brought with them from the Republic. Japan presents another fascinating legacy of Dutch Asian maritime power. For more than 2 centuries, from 1641 to 1853, the Dutch East India Company and its successors were the only Europeans permitted to trade with Japan through a tiny artificial island in Nagasaki harbour called Dejima. This extraordinary arrangement, which made the VOC the sole conduit through which Japan accessed European goods, ideas, and technology, had enormous consequences for Japanese intellectual and scientific development. The stream of European knowledge that flowed through Dejima, what the Japanese called rangaku, or Dutch learning, included medical knowledge, astronomical knowledge, botanical knowledge, and eventually military technology that played a significant role in Japan's eventual modernization. The financial instruments developed in Amsterdam during the Golden Age are perhaps the most globally consequential of all Dutch legacies. The Amsterdam Exchange Bank's model became the template for the Bank of England, founded in 1694. The joint stock company structure that the VOC pioneered became the legal basis for the business corporation, which is arguably the dominant organisational form of modern economic life. The commodity futures markets that Amsterdam traders developed for spices and grain became the model for the modern derivatives markets that process trillions of dollars of transactions daily. The Netherlands today is one of the world's most prosperous small nations, with a per capita income that ranks among the highest on Earth, and with a distinctive continuing contribution to global commerce through the Port of Rotterdam, still the largest port in Europe, and through the financial and commercial services sector centred in Amsterdam. The polder model of consensus governance that was born in the medieval flood management committees is still recognisable in Dutch political culture, which continues to be characterised by coalition government, negotiated compromise, and a certain pragmatic suspicion of ideological absolutes. The Dutch still manage water with extraordinary sophistication, and the Delta Works, the vast system of sea barriers and storm surge gates completed in the late 20th century to protect the Netherlands against the flooding threat, is one of the great engineering achievements of the modern era, as impressive in its own context as the dikes and windmills of the 17th century were in theirs. There is something in the Dutch story, that refusal to be defined by apparent disadvantage, that insistence on reimagining the rules of competition, rather than simply trying harder within the existing rules, that feels worth carrying forward. Not as a lesson in simple uplift or easy inspiration, but as a genuine historical observation, that the most consequential innovation in human history has often come not from the most powerful or the most richly resourced, but from those who faced genuine constraints and were forced, by necessity, to find genuinely new solutions. The Dutch found new solutions in the 17th century that changed the world. The solutions had costs, moral costs, human costs, environmental costs, that we are still reckoning with. But the achievement was real, the intelligence was genuine, and the courage, on those smoke-filled decks in the North Sea and in the warm waters of the Banda Archipelago and in the winding channels of the River Medway, was unquestionable. Sleep well now. The ships are at anchor. The cannon fire has stilled. The North Sea is quiet under a sky full of stars, and somewhere in Amsterdam, a city built on wooden piles driven into a riverbed, the gentle sound of water is the oldest music in the world. The Dutch knew that sound. They were born to it, and they used it for one extraordinary century to change everything. There is one more thing worth saying before the night takes us entirely. The story of the Dutch Republic is often told as a story of commercial genius, of shrewd merchants and clever financiers who turned the logic of trade into the logic of power. And that is true, but it is only part of the truth. The other part is the story of ordinary people, sailors who climbed frozen rigging in Baltic winters, soldiers who held dikes against Spanish armies, women who ran the family business while their husbands were at sea for 2 or 3 years at a time, artisans who built the ships and ground the lenses and laid the bricks of the warehouses that held the wealth of the world. The Republic was not made by grand gestures alone. It was made by the accumulated weight of 1,000 small competencies, practiced daily, passed from master to apprentice, embedded in the habits and expectations of an entire society. When we look at the great paintings from the Golden Age, the Vermeers, the Rembrandts, the quiet domestic scenes of candlelit interiors and sunlit city squares, we are looking at the self-portrait of that society, at what it valued and how it saw itself. It valued light and craft, and the careful observation of the world as it actually was rather than as it was supposed to be. Those qualities, that preference for the real over the ideal, that willingness to look closely and record honestly, were the same qualities that made Dutch cartographers the finest in the world, Dutch engineers the most inventive, Dutch merchants the most reliable, and Dutch admirals among the most effective that any age has produced. The sound of water in Amsterdam tonight is the same sound that Michiel de Ruyter heard as a child in Flushing, when the ships came in from the sea and the harbour smelled of salt and timber and the promise of distant places. It is the sound that has run through all of this story, quietly, underneath every battle and every bargain, every chart and every cannon. It is the sound of a country that made itself from water and learned to sail.